Today we're going to do a Bible lesson on the Song of Solomon. The reason I'm doing a lesson on the Song of Solomon is that I believe that the way that most pastors are interpreting this book is wrong. And not only is it wrong, but it's the exact opposite of the way that we're supposed to interpret the book. Most people seem to believe that this book is an allegory of Christ's relationship with the church, but it's extremely unlikely that God would use one of Solomon's marriages to symbolize Christ's relationship with the church, given that it was Solomon's very marriages that turned him away from God. People try to avoid this glaring problem by claiming that the book was written early in Solomon's life before he went after false gods and before he engaged in polygamy, and the woman in this book is his first wife. But when we analyze the details of this book, we can see that these assumptions are simply the opposite of the truth. But before we proceed, in this lesson, I'm going to require that you read the Song of Solomon first, if you've not already read it. It's going to be difficult to understand what we're talking about if you don't have a general idea of what the book says. Fortunately, the book is very short. It's only 8 chapters, so you can read the entire book in about 20 to 30 minutes. But I just want to warn you that it's sometimes difficult to understand who exactly is speaking in this book, and it makes some verses very confusing. So my advice is try not to get bogged down in the difficult verses. Do your first read very quickly so you can get the gist of the book, and then we'll begin the lesson. If you don't have the book available, I'll provide images of each chapter in about 20 seconds, and you can take screenshots with your phone or computer. I'm using the King James Version, and I require that you use this version also because it's the only version of the Bible that I know of that doesn't have serious errors. It's also the only version that's not copyrighted, so I can show you pictures of the chapters. Here's chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7, and chapter 8. So pause the video and read the book, and when you come back, we'll begin the lesson. All right, we're back. So if you're proceeding with this video, that means you've read the Song of Solomon. And so let's talk about first impressions. If you read this book, the first question you're going to ask is, why is this book even in the Bible? What's the purpose of it? I mean, this book is bizarre. There are 2 things that are unusual about the book. First, it doesn't mention God even one time. We all know that the purpose of the Bible is to teach us about our Creator, but this book doesn't mention God, so why is it in the Bible? There's only one other book in the Bible that doesn't mention God, and that's the book of Esther. The second thing that's unusual about this book is that it's primarily about a woman. There's only 3 books in the Bible that are primarily about women: Esther, Ruth, and this book, the Song of Solomon. But the Song of Solomon is very different from Esther and Ruth, because Esther and Ruth are historical books. They both tell important parts of the history of Israel, specifically the tribe of Judah. But the Song of Solomon doesn't explain any history of Israel. In fact, it doesn't even identify the name of the woman featured in the book. The women of the books of Esther and Ruth are clearly identified. In fact, the books are named after these women. Whereas, again, the Song of Solomon doesn't even name the woman described. Now, that's bizarre. So the book doesn't talk about history, it doesn't talk about God, and it doesn't even name the primary character in the book. The entire book is simply a love song between Solomon and one or more of his wives. Solomon tells the woman how much he loves her, and she tells him how much she loves him, and it goes back and forth for all 8 chapters. So all that said, let's now talk about what I believe the real purpose of this book is and why the King James translators put it in the Bible. We'll begin by looking at the titles. I believe that the titles of this book tell us more than anything else about the real purpose of this book. Now, notice that I said titles. There's actually more than one title for this book. The King James translators titled the book The Song of Solomon. But that's not the real title of the book. The real title can be found in the first chapter and the first verse of the book. You can see that we have a title and we have authorship given in the first verse. It was clearly written by Solomon. And the title is clearly the Song of Songs. But why did the King James translators change the title of the book to the Song of Solomon? Why didn't they just call it the Song of Songs? That's the real title of the book. That's the title that Solomon gave it. Well, let's analyze the phrase Song of Songs. When you hear the phrase Song of Songs, what does it mean to you? Well, think about the phrase King of Kings. Jesus is called the King of Kings in the Bible. When you hear that phrase, what does it mean? Well, obviously it means the greatest of all kings. So I submit to you that the phrase Song of Songs means greatest of all songs. So apparently Solomon thought that this song was the greatest of all songs, which is strange because, as mentioned previously, this song doesn't mention God even one time. So how could this song be the greatest of all songs when it doesn't mention God? The Bible tells us that Solomon wrote 1,005 songs, and of course David, Solomon's father, was a great musician, and he wrote many songs. But Solomon thought that of all those songs, this song, which doesn't mention God even one time, was the greatest of all songs. So that's pretty strange. So let's now compare that title with the title that the King James translators gave the book. They entitled the book The Song of Solomon. So the translators demoted the title. They said, this is not the greatest of all songs, the Song of Songs. This is just the Song of Solomon. You may think that a certain song is the best song. You may say, that's the best song ever written. But that's just your opinion. Other people may not think that that's the greatest song. Solomon was saying, this is the greatest of all songs, and the translators they demoted the title, and they said, no, this is not the greatest of all songs. This is just the Song of Solomon. It's his favorite song. I think that's the most important clue that we can use to discover the real purpose of this book. So let's now analyze the phrase Song of Solomon. So what does that title mean to you? Well, have you ever heard someone say, that person is singing the same old song? Or they're playing my song on the radio? These phrases are saying that whatever the content of the song is, it describes the focus of the person's heart, or the passions or desires of the heart. So I believe that what the King James translators are trying to tell us is that whatever the content of this book is, that describes the primary focus of Solomon's heart. That's what the purpose of the book is, to describe what Solomon's focus was in his life. Now, if you've read the book, you know that this book is simply a love song between Solomon and his wife, or you're going to find it might be actually a love song between him and multiple wives. So, is there anything in the Bible that would support the idea that Solomon's primary focus in life was his wives? Well, there are two things we can immediately look to. First, I mentioned previously that the Bible tells us that Solomon's wives turn him to false gods. So Solomon put his wives above the commandments of God. This is pretty strong evidence that his primary focus was women. The second thing we can look at is that the Bible tells us that he had 1,000 wives. Now, obviously, the primary reason that he had so many wives was that he was rich. But this does suggest that much of the focus of his heart was women. You might say that he was overly distracted with women to the point of excess. So I think that the real purpose of the insertion of this book in the Bible is to show us that Solomon valued his wives above all else, even God. Jesus said, he that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Matthew 10:37. Now, as I mentioned, many people teach that this book is an allegory of Christ's relationship with the church. If this is true, then the relationship between Solomon and his wife that's described in this book surely must be one condoned by God, and nearly a perfect example of a good relationship. But in our culture, polygamy is frowned upon, especially by Christians. So in order to promote the allegorical interpretation, people assume that this is Solomon's first marriage, and that God would never use a relationship within the context of polygamy as a symbol of his relationship with the church. Now, before I proceed, I want to say that I'm not stating that polygamous relationships would disqualify a person in Middle Eastern culture living thousands of years in the past as being used as a symbol of Christ and His church. I'm simply saying, or I'm going to show, that the people who believe this allegorical interpretation are not looking at the clear details of this book, and consequently their interpretation is not necessarily credible when it comes to actually figuring out what the book means. So let's go into the book and see what it actually says about Solomon's romantic life. If you read chapter 6, verse 8, it says, "There are 80 queens and 80 concubines and virgins without number. My dove, my undefiled, is but one." So this verse is saying that this woman is only one of the 140 wives of Solomon. At this time, he had 140 wives when this book was written. The only argument that one could make against this is that these queens and concubines are from other nations. But think about how unlikely that would be. Why would Solomon mention queens and concubines from other nations? Why would that be relevant to this song? Now, if you still doubt that Solomon had multiple wives at the time this book was written, read chapter 3, verse 11. It says, quote, "Go forth, O you daughters of Zion, and behold King Solomon with the crown wherewith his mother crowned him in the day of his espousals." An espousal is a marriage. And notice that the word is plural, espousals. And it says his mother crowned him, past tense, in the day of his espousals, meaning that these marriages happened in the past before the book was written. This is irrefutable evidence that Solomon had multiple wives at the time this book was written. The author's not even ashamed of it. She states it clearly. The person that was speaking in that part of the book was actually Solomon's wife, or one of his wives. Now, if that's not evidence enough, read 2 verses ahead, and it says, "King Solomon made himself a chariot of the wood of Lebanon. He made the pillars thereof of silver, the bottom thereof of gold, the covering of it of purple, the midst thereof being paved with love, for the daughters of Jerusalem." This is most likely telling us that Solomon's chariot was designed for him to be with his wives as he was traveling from point A to point B. Now, you might be able to argue that this is talking about his mother or his sisters or his daughters, but if that's true, why would it say that the midst of his chariot is paved with love for the daughters of Jerusalem? It seems unlikely she's talking about anyone other than Solomon's wives. Also, 3 times in this book, chapter 2, verse 7, chapter 3, verse 5, and chapter 8, verse 4, the woman says, quote, "I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, that ye stir not up nor awake my love until he please." But think about that. Why would she be telling other women not to wake Solomon up? She's telling these women not to wake him up because they're in his bedchamber. They're his wives. Furthermore, the woman often refers to herself with the plural pronoun we. In chapter 1, verses 4 through 5, she says, "Because of the savor of thy good ointments, thy name is as ointment poured forth. Therefore do the virgins love thee. Draw me, we will run after thee. The king hath brought me into his chambers. We will be glad and rejoice in thee. We will remember thy love more than wine." So this woman isn't just speaking for herself. She's speaking for all the wives of Solomon, most likely. And that's probably one of the reasons that Solomon loved this song so much and called it the greatest of all songs, the Song of Songs, because it was representing the collective love of all of his wives. The plural pronoun is used again in chapter 8, verses 8 through 9. The woman says, "We have a little sister, and she hath no breasts. What shall we do for our sister in the day when she shall be spoken for? If she be a wall, we will build upon her a palace of silver. And if she be a door, we will enclose her with boards of cedar." It keeps saying we. Who's we? Think about that. Well, I submit to you that these are Solomon's 140 wives that he was married to at the time this book was written. People don't want to believe that this book is celebrating polygamous relationships, but it seems pretty clear that that's what it's doing. People tend to think that women were forced against their will in Middle Eastern culture to marry or to be involved in polygamous relationships. But this woman seems to be indicating that she's celebrating the polygamous relationships of Solomon. People tend to think that in those days women were beaten over the head and dragged against their will, but we're going to find later on in this book that these women were literally running after Solomon. Now, I'm not condoning polygamous relationships. The purpose of this lesson is not to talk about the virtues of polygamy or to necessarily criticize polygamy and try to judge Solomon. The purpose of this lesson is to simply interpret this book for what it is rather than twisting it into something we think it should be. Again, the purpose of this book is to show us that Solomon was overly distracted with women. He was consumed with women. That's why it's called the Song of Solomon. The song of his heart, his focus in life was women. He was completely consumed by them. And that's one of the reasons he engaged in polygamy, because he was consumed by these women. His heart was, the number one focus of his heart was these women. Jesus told us that you can have only one master. Solomon's master was these women, and their wishes became his number one priority in life, while the wishes of God became secondary. And that's what we're supposed to learn from this book. We're not supposed to read the book and think it's so romantic and it's so pleasant to read how these people were in love, like we're reading a formulaic romantic novel or something. The purpose of this book goes much deeper than that. The purpose of this book is to be a warning that the number one focus of our hearts should be the Creator rather than the creation. But it's so easy to be completely consumed by your wife or your family to the point where you forget about your Creator. One of the greatest mistakes that people make in the history of the world is to be completely distracted by the creation and forget your Creator. And that is not wise. In fact, it's deadly. I'm going to show that that message is the real purpose for the insertion of this book in the Bible. I also want to mention that the first of Solomon's marriages mentioned in the Bible is his marriage with the daughter of Pharaoh, 1 Kings 3:1. The woman in the Song of Solomon could be the daughter of Pharaoh, I guess, given that she is described as a prince's daughter. She was royalty, chapter 7, verse 1. But if you know the Bible, you know that God would never use Solomon's relationship with an Egyptian as a symbol of his relationship with the church. God told the Israelites not to go back to Egypt. God said in Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20, "When thou art come unto the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, and shalt possess it, and shalt dwell therein, and shalt say, I will set a king over me, like as all the nations that are about me, thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose." In other words, God shall choose the king. If you are going to set up a king, then you're not supposed to choose somebody from a different nation, and the Lord is saying that I will choose who he's going to be. The Lord goes on to say, "One from among thy brethren shalt thou set over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother. But he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he should multiply horses." So, the kings are not to go back to Egypt for any reason, and it's specifically the reason to multiply horses. So keep that in mind. "For as much as the Lord hath said unto you, ye shall henceforth return no more that way." The Lord really did not want them going back to Egypt. "Neither shall he multiply wives to himself." Are you listening? All the people out there that want to understand what this book means, listen. Listen to this verse. Stop, concentrate, and listen. "Neither shall he multiply." This is talking about the future kings. Solomon is a king. It says right here, "Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away." The Song of Solomon, I believe, is about Solomon's heart. That's why it's called the Song of Solomon. The King James translators changed the title of the book from the Song of Songs to the Song of Solomon. It's not the Song of Songs. It's not the greatest of all songs. It's simply the Song of Solomon. It tells us what the focus of his heart was. And the Lord told the Israelites, "Your king shall not multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away." So that's a key point. "Neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold, And it shall be, when he sitteth upon the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write him a copy of this law in a book out of that which is before the priests the Levites, and it shall be with him, and he shall read therein all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of this law and these statutes, to do them, that his heart be not lifted up above his brethren, and that he turn not aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, to the end that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. So those are really, really big clues to what this book is really about. God did not want Israel to return to Egypt because the Egyptians were pagans who had no knowledge of God. God brought the Israelites out of Egypt. He did not want them going back. Well, Solomon didn't just go back to Egypt. He married Pharaoh's daughter. Marriage is the greatest form of integration. There's no greater connection that you can make with another human being than marriage. So that's exactly what God did not want them to do. In fact, everything that God told kings not to do in Deuteronomy 17, Solomon did. He said not to go back to Egypt for horses. 1 Kings 10:28 says that Solomon had horses brought out of Egypt. God told kings not to multiply silver and gold. But in 1 Kings 10:14 and 10:21, it says that the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 636 talents of gold. And all King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. For the king had at sea a navy of Tarshish, bringing gold and silver. God also told the kings not to multiply wives, that their hearts would not turn away. This is exactly what Solomon did. He became enamored and distracted by his wives until his heart was turned away from God. He did multiply wives. 1 Kings 11 tells us, But King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites, of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, Ye shall not go into them, neither shall they come in unto you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clave unto these in love, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it came to pass, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the Lord, as did David his father. Then did Solomon build an high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Moloch, the abomination of the children of Ammon, that is the descendants of the Ammonites. And likewise did he for all his strange wives, which burnt incense and sacrificed unto their gods. So Solomon did everything that God commanded that the Israelite kings not do back in the days of Deuteronomy when Moses was still alive. Not only did God tell kings not to worship other gods, but he also told Solomon directly that if he worshipped other gods, that the Lord would drive the Israelites from their land and destroy the temple. In 1 Kings 9:6-7, God says to Solomon, But if ye shall at all turn from following me, ye or your children, and will not keep my commandments and my statutes which I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel out of the land which I have given them, and this house which I have hallowed for my name will I cast out of my sight. When he says the house, he's referring to the temple. So Solomon did worship other gods, and the Israelites were taken from their land, and the temple was burned. So here's the big question. Again, paraphrasing, God told Solomon, if you worship other gods, I'm going to destroy the kingdom, and I'm going to take the Israelites out of their land. So did Solomon worship other gods? Yes, he did. Here's the big question. Are you ready for this? Why did he worship other gods? He worshiped other gods because the women that he loved turned him to these false gods. He loved women who worshiped other gods, and he raised children with those women, and the children became the princes and princesses of Israel, the royalty, the leaders of Israel, and it corrupted the entire nation. That's the key to all of this. That's what the Song of Solomon is about. The Bible is full of stories relating to this topic, where men integrate women into their families that don't know God, or women integrate men, for that matter, into their families that don't know God, and their descendants are led away from God. That's why the sons of Noah were turned away from God. And the sons of Abraham were eventually turned away from God. And the sons of Lot. And the sons of Esau. And so on and so forth. People don't realize that this book is really talking about that theme, which is one of the most important themes in the history of mankind, going all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Just off the top of my head, Esau. You remember Jacob and Esau? They were the sons of Isaac and Rebekah. Jacob married women who had the knowledge of God, but Esau married 2 Hittite women. Now remember, those Hittites, those were some of the people that were mentioned, that God mentioned, that he said that he did not want the Israelites to marry them. Well, Esau married 2 Hittite women. And his descendants, the Edomites, they never followed God. They never helped. And the reason they didn't follow God was because the mothers that raised the entire nation, they were pagan. Esau was a man who was not led by his intellect. Instead, he was led by his emotions. If you remember the story, he gave away his birthright because he didn't want to wait 20 minutes for his supper. He had to have his pottage now. He said, "I'm at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do to me?" He wasn't going to die. He just wanted his supper now. He was impulsive. Have you ever met somebody like that? They just go by their emotions. They want what they want now. So most likely Esau was easily overtaken and consumed by the paganism of his 2 Hittite wives, which is why the Edomites are repeatedly listed as some of the pagan people that God commanded that the Israelites should not marry. Ahab is another example. Ahab married a Zidonian, Jezebel. And the Zidonians are another one of those groups that God told the Israelites not to marry. And if you compare scripture to scripture, it's pretty easy to prove that marriage resulted in not only his death, but the death of all his family. And Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, is another example. He married the daughter of Jezebel, the daughter of Ahab, who was Athaliah. Athaliah was half Sidonian, and if you compare scripture to scripture there also, you can pretty easily prove that that marriage caused the destruction of the entire house of Jehoshaphat. And you're probably wondering, how could that possibly be? Well, that's the point of this lesson, to show you why God repeatedly told the Israelites to stay away from these pagan people. The Israelites at the time of the Judges, as another example. Judges 3:5-7 says, "And the children of Israel dwelt among the Canaanites and Hittites." There's those Hittites again. God commanded not to marry the Hittites. And remember, Esau married 2 Hittite women. And it says, "The Amorites and Perizzites and Hivites and Jebusites, and they took their daughters to be their wives, and gave their daughters to their sons, and served their gods." Are you noticing that marriage is the key here? Marriage is the basis of society. If marriage goes wrong, if marriage is not based on the knowledge of God and the scriptures, then you've got a big problem. "And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and forgat the Lord their God, and served Baalim and the groves." We have the book of Nehemiah and the book of Ezra, which are primarily about how the returning Jews were intermarrying with people, and the Bible is just full of story after story after story, demonstrating that if you don't marry somebody who follows God, then the future of your family is going to be in jeopardy, to say the least. Genesis 6:1-7 says that the sons of God saw women that they were fair, and took them wives of all which they chose, which is probably referring to polygamy, and that somehow caused the destruction of the world. So the Bible is full of these stories. We could talk about this for hours, but that's the key. That's what's really happening here. Genesis 6:1-7 says, "The sons of God married women because they were fair, not because of their relationships with God, and these marriages produced children that were mighty and renowned," meaning powerful and influential, "and the children did not follow the ways of God and they caused other people not to follow God, and therefore the entire world was destroyed by the flood. That's what that passage actually means. And I'd like to tell you more about that passage. I wrote a book about it called That His Heart Turned Not Away, and I'm going to make that book available for free online eventually, but we don't have time to go into that. But that's really what that passage means. That's what I believe the correct interpretation of that passage is. The life of Solomon follows that pattern exactly. The children produced by his marriages became the mighty and renowned, and we will show that they turned Israel away from God. Also, it's important to mention that the sons of God went after women because they were beautiful. Again, the sons of God in chapter 6 of Genesis, they went after women. Why? Because they were beautiful. Is that not exactly what the Song of Solomon is talking about? Think about it. The Song of Solomon is talking about how beautiful this woman is. In fact, the woman featured in this book is called the fairest among women. It uses that same archaic word, fair, instead of the word beauty, which is what we would use today. Now, it's also important to mention Solomon's son, Rehoboam. Again, I've been mentioning that the children that are produced by the intermarrying, they become the royalty, and that's how the kingdom starts to erode. So King Rehoboam, he was the man that became king after Solomon. And look what the Bible tells us about Rehoboam. 1 Kings 14:21 through 24 says, quote, "And Rehoboam the son of Solomon reigned in Judah. Rehoboam was 41 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city which the Lord did choose out of all the tribes of Israel to put his name there. And listen to this. His mother's name was Naamah, an Ammonitess." That's an important point. Now remember what the Bible said about the Ammonites. The Bible says Solomon loved many strange women together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites. The Ammonites are listed there, and it says, "These are the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, Ye shall not go into them, neither shall they come unto you, for surely they would turn away your heart after their gods." And it tells us that Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and he worshipped the god Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. So his Ammonite wives caused him to worship this false god Molech. And now we go down to Rehoboam, and we're learning about Rehoboam, who was the next king, the most powerful man in Israel after Solomon. Rehoboam took over the kingdom, and it says his mother was Naamah, an Ammonitess. So his mother, we have to assume, if we're going to be rational people here, we have to assume that Naamah, Rehoboam's mother, was one of those Ammonite women who were causing Solomon to worship that false god. Again, God told them, do not marry these people because it will destroy the entire nation. And now we see that Solomon married these pagan wives, and now his son is a man whose mother is an Ammonitess. And we're told that Solomon's Ammonite wives caused him to worship Molech. So at this point, even before I know anything about Rehoboam, other than his mother was an Ammonitess, before I know anything about it, I'm going to predict that as we read this verse, as we continue to read this verse, I'm going to predict that Rehoboam is not going to be a God-fearing man. He's not going to be a man that does what God wanted him to do. He's going to be an evil man. So let's continue reading. Next sentence. "And Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him to jealousy with their sins which they had committed above all that their fathers had done. For they also built them high places and images and groves on every high hill and under every green tree. And there were also Sodomites in the land, and they did according to all the abominations of the nations which the Lord cast out before the children of Israel." So under Rehoboam's reign, the Israelites had reduced themselves into a sinful nation again. 2 Chronicles 12:1 says, "And it came to pass when Rehoboam had established the kingdom and had strengthened himself, he forsook the law of the Lord, and all Israel with him." So we can see that it's just not likely that God would celebrate one of Solomon's marriages or use one of his marriages as a symbol of Christ's relationship with the church, given that the children produced by these marriages were corrupt. The Bible indicates that the purpose for marriage is to produce a godly seed. So Solomon married pagan women because of their beauty, not realizing the magnitude of what would result because of their paganism. Because these women were pagan, their children were also pagan. And because Solomon's children were the princes and princesses of the nation, they became the mighty and renowned, the rich and powerful. And when they turned to sin, all of Israel followed them. You need to understand that this is not some random phenomenon in the Bible. This is one of the central themes of the entire history of the world. And God warned the people multiple times that if they did this, if they founded their families on people who did not know him, then it would be like building a house on sand. Marriage is the foundation of society. If your marriage is founded upon the law of God and the knowledge of God, then you're safe. But if your marriage is founded on something else, then you got problems. I also want to mention the book of Nehemiah. Let's hear what Nehemiah says about the legacy of Solomon's wives. Because again, the people that are reading this book and saying that the Song of Solomon is an allegory of Christ's relationship with the church need to read what Nehemiah said about the legacy of Solomon. Now, let me give you the context of the book of Nehemiah. The Judeans were taken into captivity by Babylon, and they were there for 70 years, but when the Babylonians were conquered by the Medo-Persians eventually released the Judeans, what we now call the Jews, and they returned to Jerusalem. And the book of Nehemiah tells us about the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So that's the context of the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah says, "In those days also I saw Jews that had married wives of Ashdod, of Ammon and Moab." These are the same pagan people that God told the Israelites not to marry hundreds of years previously. And Nehemiah said, "Their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, and could not speak in the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people." Now notice what Nehemiah says. A lot of people who have not studied this, they say, well, what's the big deal? So they married some exotic women, so what? Read what Nehemiah does. He said, "I contended with them, and cursed them, and smote certain of them, and plucked off their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, Ye shall not give your daughters unto their sons, nor take their daughters unto your sons, or for yourselves. Did not Solomon king of Israel sin by these things? Yet among many nations there was no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, even him did outlandish women cause to sin. Shall we then hearken unto you to do all this great evil, to transgress against our God in marrying strange wives?" There's that word again, strange. That's the same word that the writer of 1 Kings 11:1 used to describe these women because they didn't know God. And it's the same word that God used to describe the children of these women because they didn't know God. And because they didn't know God, they didn't know the commandments of God. So they stole, they lied, they murdered, just like Athaliah and Jezebel and many of these pagan women. So Nehemiah feels so strongly about this, so strongly about marrying women who know God versus marrying women who don't know God, that he actually hit the Israelites in the face. He smote them. He punched them in the face. He cursed them, and he ripped their hair off. There's a lot of people today that say, well, Christians shouldn't be confrontational. They shouldn't be, they shouldn't hurt people's feelings. But Nehemiah punched people in the face, apparently. I don't really know what it means to smote somebody, but apparently he hit them, and he ripped off their hair. That's how strongly he felt about the danger of integrating these people. Again, God told the Israelites very clearly, do not integrate these people into your nation, or else you will be destroyed. You'll perish. or you'll be cut off, which means the same thing as perish or to be destroyed if you compare Scripture to Scripture. Now, if this is the legacy of Solomon, how likely do you think it is that God would use one of Solomon's marriages as a symbol of his relationship with the church? Now, some people might say that even though Solomon had many pagan wives, he probably also had hundreds of Israelite wives, and the Song of Solomon may have focused on one of those women. This could be true, but nonetheless, even if he had Israelite wives, they didn't succeed in keeping him from worshiping false gods. So given that it was his pagan wives that got the better of him, it's unlikely that Solomon's marriages would be used as an allegory of Christ's relationship with the church. Now, we've analyzed the titles of this book and the context of Solomon's life at the time this book was written, and the legacy of Solomon's marriages, including the children these marriages produced. I'd now like to read what I believe is the most important passage in the Song of Solomon, the most telling passage. This passage represents what I believe is the climax of the entire book, and it gives us insight into the real purpose for the insertion of the Song of Solomon. The passage is in the last chapter, verses 6 through 7. It says, "Set me as a seal upon thine heart, as a seal upon thine arm. For love is strong as death, jealousy is cruel as the grave. The coals thereof are coals of fire, which hath a most vehement flame. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it." And here's the climax of the entire book. You ready? Here it is. "If a man would give all the substance of his house for love, it would utterly be contemned." And that word contemn is not a spelling error. That word means to treat with contempt. Remember what Jesus said, "No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other." What good are riches and houses and cars and career if you don't have somebody to share it with? So if a man had to choose, obviously he would choose to be with a woman rather than have all those other things and be alone. That's what this is talking about. What this verse is trying to tell us is that if a man had to choose between his woman and everything else would be treated with contempt. The woman is considered the greatest possession for the man. So again, if a man would give all the substance of his house for love, it would utterly be contemned. That's what the book is about. Solomon would have given away everything he had for the love of his wives. His wives became the number one priority, even above the commandments of God. We see this in the life of Adam and Eve. Adam chose to give everything he had to Eve, even his very life. 1 Timothy 2:14 says, "Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression." So he knew exactly what he was doing, and he chose to die just so that Eve wouldn't be alone. Proverbs 31 tells us that there was a king named Lemuel, and his mother gave him the following advice. Now keep in mind, this is a woman saying this to her son. This is a woman, a mother saying this to her son. She said, "Give not thy strength unto women, nor thy ways to that which destroyeth kings." Proverbs 31:3. This woman is telling her son that a king can be destroyed by women. She goes on to say in verse 30, "Favor is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised." She's saying that beauty is vain, but that's what the entire Song of Solomon is about. Beauty. It's about a person who's called the fairest among women. The entire book is about physical beauty. But this woman is saying, favor is deceitful and beauty is vain. But a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. So again, I believe the purpose of this book is to show us that the primary focus of Solomon's heart was his women. And that's why it's called the Song of Solomon. It was the song of his heart. It's a song that talks not about only one woman, but about 140 women. And the woman featured in this book refers to other wives of Solomon with the plural pronoun we. God told kings not to multiply wives because they would turn their hearts away from God. Apparently, simply multiplying wives can distract a man to the point where he places his wives even above the commandments of God. For most men, even one woman can be too much of a distraction, let alone 1,000. Remember what Jesus said. He who loves mother, father, daughter, son more than me is not worthy of me. That's exactly what happened to Solomon. He was distracted by his wives. They were his primary focus. They were the song of his heart, which is why Solomon entitled this book the Song of Songs, the greatest of all songs, even though it doesn't mention God one time. Now, please understand that the purpose of this lesson is not to judge Solomon, because most men in the history of the world are not tempted at the level that Solomon was tempted. Remember the Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation. Anybody can be led into temptation, you or me or anybody. But the richer a man is, the more attractive he is to women. And Solomon was the richest man in the world. I'm not saying that that's all that women care about, but it's pretty obvious that the more money a man has, the more attractive he is to women. Well, Solomon, again, was the richest man in the world. He was so rich that the Queen of Sheba came to visit him, and the Bible tells us that when she saw his kingdom and all his wealth, there was no more spirit in her, 2 Chronicles 9:4. That means that she was left breathless. Solomon had thousands of women chasing after him. The woman in the Song of Solomon says, quote, "We will run after thee." He literally had women chasing after him. Again, the purpose of this book is not to give us some symbolic, allegory of Christ's relationship with the church. The purpose of this book is to show us the primary focus of Solomon's heart. He believed that the greatest song that was ever written is this song, a song about the beauty of his wives. And unfortunately, he married women that were pagan, as the Bible tells us. Again, this is not me. This is not my opinion. This is what the Bible tells us. And he had children with these women that were, again, they were taught pagan religion by their parents. And both Solomon and his wives went after Molech, and they went after all kinds of pagan gods, and the entire kingdom started to erode, all because of Solomon's marriages. So how likely do you think it is that God would use one of Solomon's marriages as an allegory of Christ's relationship with the church? If you study all of this information, if you study what the Bible tells us, how likely do you think that is? The scriptures indicate pretty clearly that the allegorical interpretation is the exact opposite of the way we're supposed to interpret this book. Now, there's a lot more we could talk about when it comes to this general Bible theme, but I don't want this class to go too long, so we'll talk more about this theme in another Bible lesson. And I'll end by saying, you may not have agreed with everything we talked about today, but hopefully you learned something, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next Bible lesson.